My name is Mary Maller. Today I'm going to be presenting a work called Sonic, which is a SNARK that we've been building over the past year, really. It took a while. And this was joint work with Sean Bowe from Zk, Mark Ulf, who's in Edinburgh, and Sarah, who is at UCL with me. So the aim is to build a SNARK. And what are these? They are a tool that you can use for building applications where you care about privacy and about things being correct at the same time. So having something that's private is very easy, because if you don't care about it being correct, you can just sort of say, this commitment contains something, and it wouldn't be hard to hide what it was. And having something correct that's not private is also fairly easy, because you can just say, here's what here's my thing, it satisfies this property, and then people could check it in the clear. But having both properties hold at the same time is something which becomes more complicated, and this is where we tend to use zero-knowledge proofs. By the way, if I go too fast at any point in this presentation, feel free to ask questions and such. So the way we define this formally is we have three properties. We want correctness. An honest prover can always convince an honest verifier. We want zero knowledge, meaning that a malicious verifier cannot learn any useful information from an honest prover beyond what they're supposed to learn anyway. And we want it to be knowledge sound, and this essentially means that a malicious prover cannot convince an honest verifier. So three example situations where we'd want to use SNARK. There's anonymity. So you might want to try and spend some currency without revealing who you are. There is privacy. And this isn't so much about not revealing who you are, this is more trying to reveal what's inside your transaction. So it might be like a ranged proof, trying to show that a value is between 0 and 10. And the other one, which is starting to be a use case that's coming up recently, is scalability. Because with these SNARK things, where the verifier is actually quicker than just verifying the statement in the clear, if you don't care about privacy at all, this would still be better than sending all of the information and checking it yourself, because someone could do the work once and then everyone else could just check it very quickly. The reason why we want SNARKs rather than any other type of NIZK proof, well, we don't always want SNARKs. There's situations where other NIZK proofs would be the ideal situation. But the two properties they have, which is really nice, is that they have very, very small proof sizes and extremely fast verification. Like when I say small proof sizes, I'm talking usually around 256 bytes, something like that. When I'm talking fast verification, it's usually just a number of pairing equations, which if you're just verifying one thing might be more expensive than other situations, but if you're verifying lots of things, then you only actually have to calculate the pairing like once or twice, so it becomes very cheap. But they require trusted setup, which is an issue which has been gaining a lot of attention recently, especially with different setup ceremonies that people are having to do to try and get around this. And the issue fundamentally is that a zero-knowledge argument has a trapdoor by definition. The way you say that we cannot break privacy is you say, somebody that did not know any information about the witness or your secrets at all could still convince a verifier if they had this piece of unrelated information which they shouldn't actually have in the real world. And this becomes a problem if it becomes possible for people to know the trapdoor in the real world. It doesn't affect privacy so much, because you still get full privacy like a verifier that knows a trapdoor doesn't learn any information about a prover most of the time, but a prover who is malicious might now be able to convince an honest verifier. So if you're talking Zcash, you might be able to spend Zcash with that you don't actually own. If you're talking confidential transactions, you could say something is in a given range, and actually it could be far beyond that given range. And if you're talking scalability, it could be that the thing that you're saying satisfies a statement and is very compact, has nothing to do with the statement at all. So all zero-knowledge arguments have these trapdoors, by the way. It's not the case that some do and some don't. But some of these trapdoors are randomly generated. And what that means is that if you want to use the system in practice, what you can do is you can say, we need a set of random generators. Let's just take some input, be very public about what the input is, and then hash it to get what our actual parameters that we're going to use are. And this is what we would typically call an untrusted setup. The problem with doing this with SNARKs is that the hidden trapdoor is not chosen at random. It in fact has quite a lot of structure which you want to exist, and you've got to somehow generate these parameters with this structure without being able to use hash. Well, if you could use a hash function, that would be great, but we don't know a way to do it. So yeah, if you have a NIZK, so this would be something like bulletproofs or STARKs or whatever, you still have these parameters, but they're totally random. If you have a SNARK, they have a high level of structure. So this is an overview of some of the different benefits of a couple of different zero-knowledge proving systems. I haven't included everything here. I've just chosen STARKs, bulletproofs, and SNARKs, mostly because they're gaining a lot of attention at the moment rather than anything else. Good things about SNARKs, very small proof sizes, verification is very fast, but they require trusted setup. Then you have bulletproofs, which have a trustless setup, and actually also have quite small proof sizes. It's usually only like a kilobyte or something, but their verification is not fast. In particular, their verification is linear in the statement that you're trying to prove. So if you wanted to use them for scalability, then every time you applied a bulletproof, your verifier would grow. So it wouldn't be great for that. Then you have STARKs, which again have trustless setup. These also have good asymptotics in terms of proof size and verifier time, and they use symmetric key cryptography, which means that their provers are faster than things that are using asymmetric cryptography. But they do end up having a large concrete overhead. So sure, the prover would be great if you were trying to prove something with an absolutely huge number of constraints. But it would have to be huge before the asymptotics would take effect. If you're just proving something smaller, then you probably wouldn't want to pay this overhead. So how can we actually use these things? Of course, we can't just have one person generating the trapdoor. So what we typically do is we say, let's get a group of participants and have them all contribute to the trapdoor. And then each participant is going to learn some useful information about the trapdoor. But we can design schemes where, provided at least one party is honest in all of their participants who are trying to generate these parameters, the final scheme should be secure. And you know, this is reasonably powerful. It's not so great if you just have 6 people in the setup, but once you're talking like thousands, it becomes reasonably likely that one of those people might not be colluding. I mean, maybe if you have it so that they all happen to be minors, this would become quite likely, but if it was like a very open procedure where anyone could take part and everyone was like very public about this is my contribution, you can do some fairly good audits. So I would say the bigger issue with them is the fact that once you've done this trusted setup, that's what you're proving. You can't go back at some point and be there like, actually in our constraint system it would be better if we did it like this because there's a security bug, or because it's a totally new system maybe, or because we found an efficiency improvement. You can't do that. Once it's there, you're done. So you end up having to do a different trusted setup for every single thing you want to prove, even if you only change it in a very moderate way. And I was talking before about how if you just have a trusted setup and there's lots of people taking part, you can audit it, maybe it's not so bad. If you're trying to audit every single setup that's ever been done by anyone you want to interact with, that becomes more problematic. For a start, it becomes harder to find people that want to actually take part in your ceremony. And this, I would say, is the big thing that Sonic improves on over previous SNARKs. So in Sonic, we just have one setup. And once you've done that one setup, you can use it for anything you like, up to a given size. You can't prove something which has too many gates for your setup, but as long as the number of constraints is within your limit, you're okay. So roughly speaking, the setup ceremony for prior SNARKs would work in two phases. In your first phase, you'd start with a reference string that has the structure you want, and then you'd have somebody that would come along and they would add some more randomness. Everyone would check that the new statement still had the correct structure, and they would provide a proof that they've updated it correctly. Then, once you've got that reference string, somebody else can come along and do exactly the same thing. And you can just repeat this process again and again and again until you think you've got enough participants. But at some point in time, this first stage of the setup has to stop. You have to say, that's it, we have enough participants from this stage, we're going to move on to the next one. And once you do that, you can no longer edit the output of this stage of the setup. In the second stage, this is the part where you try and make your scheme application specific. And this time, you're still going to have someone come along and add some randomness, and then another person come along and add some randomness, and then another person come along and add some randomness. Same thing again. But the thing that they're trying to, the structure that they're trying to produce is not going to be this generalized structure. It's going to be something that they've decided in advance, and they have a specific polynomial for. And this part of the setup you can continue with indefinitely, but at this point you can't go back and change the first step. So in Sonic, we just get rid of that second step entirely. And the first step looks very similar to the first step of prior zk-SNARKs, fairly similar to the Powers of Tau ceremony even. We just don't have a phase 2. So you notice I was talking about people coming along and updating the parameters one by one by one. This is an additional security property I would say that we get, being updatability. This idea that at any point in time, anyone can come along and update the parameters. And after they've done so, they know that provided their own contribution is sound, the whole scheme should be sound. This doesn't say anything about the proofs that are generated before they took part. It's a downside. You can't say, because I updated the parameters at 12 p.m., a proof that was done at 10 a.m. is sound. But you can say that because I updated the parameters at 12 p.m., a proof that was generated at 1 p.m. is sound.
So how do you know the proof generated at 10 p.m. is sound, 10 a.m. is sound too?
At this point, you're back into the case of a normal trusted setup SNARK, and you have to trust that at least one of the people that participated in the ceremony before before this proof was generated was honest.
So at any time t minus 1, you're subject to the person that's just updated?
No, you're subject to all of the people that have previously updated.
What if one person's bad?
That's fine, as long as not all of them are. So you're saying, what if one person's bad? It wouldn't matter. So if you had 10 people that had done an update, it wouldn't matter if 9 of them were bad. It would only matter if all 10 were bad.
What about the first one?
Also wouldn't matter. Doesn't matter which order, as long as somebody is honest at some point in the process. So yeah, this is a nice property that's an especially distrustful user could update the parameters themselves. But I would say the bigger contribution is this universality thing, the fact that one setup does all. Okay, this is again my point about no guarantees are made about SNARKs output before an honest update occurs. As for the update proofs themselves, they are very, very small. You are just proving knowledge of a single hidden element. This element has no structure, there's nothing special about it. And you can use a variety of proofs, really, although I would say that because we have quite a lot of updates, we are in a situation where tightness matters. Namely that typically when you're doing a security proof, there's a little bit of security loss per proof. And you want to have a rough idea of what that loss is going to be so that you can make sure that it's really, really small, even if you have 1,000, 1,000,000 proofs. The actual reference strings themselves, these don't need to be stored forever, but they do need to be stored with respect to any proof that's generated with respect to them. So what you could do is you could generate, say, 1,000 updates with 1,000 reference strings, and then just take the final reference string from that thing and say, this is the one we're going to use for this period in time, and just dispose of all of the others. As long as the update proofs have been stored, you can still verify that every single update has been included. And they're linear sized, which isn't too bad. Like, these are things that you would be able to store on just a standard PC. Mm-hmm.
When you say the reference string needs to be stored as verified proofs, do you mean for each proof? Does it carry with it the reference string?
I mean, it needs to have a pointer to the reference string that it's proved with respect to.
Okay, so something on the network is stored on reference strings and you use that hash to refer to it, for example.
That's how I'd picture it happening. Although one other thing I should point out is that the verifier's reference string is much smaller than the prover's reference string. So the linear size that I was talking about that you need in order to generate proofs, the actual thing that would need to be stored forever is probably much, much smaller than that. Okay, and this is the thing saying that these global parameters could be stored, updated, and verified on a personal laptop I say moderate, they are quite large circuits, but I'm probably talking somewhere between 1 million and 1 billion gates, something like that. So when we're trying to have an application-specific scheme, we are going to need some information about this application in the parameters. But this is something that we choose to derive from our reference string. And the deriving process is something that can be done by anyone. You don't need any secrets, it's just a deterministic algorithm that takes an input and produces an output. It's fairly fast to run, again linear time, and the application-dependent parameters are very small. So if you were just doing this once, probably wouldn't be worth it, but if you were proving the same thing many, 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 many times, then it becomes worth it. So this is like the general setting where you don't have any additional help, where you're just a prover, you take in your parameters, you output a proof, a verifier takes them, the verifier runs a verification. And we get something which is constant size, which theoretically we were there like, this is great, it's constant, no one's done that before. But the actual constants we get, especially for the prover computation, I would say, are not that small. So if we're talking proof size, when I say guesstimated, what I mean is that I literally looked at the paper and went through counting element by element in order to figure out the proof size. We don't have an implementation of this version of the protocol. But I guesstimated that it was something between 1 and 1.5 kilobytes per proof, but that the prover would possibly be 30 times more expensive than Grot16, which is the current state of the art for SNARKs. So not great. Although, saying this, it is slightly better, possibly. Again, the way I was calculating this was just going through counting, because all of these elements that are being generated by the prover are in the first source group of the bilinear pairing, and these elements are much faster to compute and smaller than elements in the second source group, and we don't have any elements in the second source group. But the actual version of Sonic, which I would say is much more usable in practice, is one where we make this additional assumption about there being helpers available. And in this situation, we get 256 bytes per proof. And it is still more expensive for the prover than the state of the art, but probably more like 3 times rather than 30 times. And the helper time, again, is reasonably fast to run. I mean, it still is going to depend on the size of the circuit. It's still going to be comparable with the amount of time it takes to prove, and this is going to be multiplied per proof they're helping with. But it's not going to be enormous. And the same point about the prover time is possibly actually better than this, because I was counting this as if all of the group operations were done in the same group in the Grot16 protocol, and that's not actually true. They have some operations in the first group and some operations in the second. We only have operations in the first.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Is it possible to create batch proofs using Sonic? Or is it possible to verify a batch of Sonic proofs in one go with the aggregate cost per proof is lower than verifying them individually?
That's kind of where I'm getting to.
Okay.
We just need a helper to help us do it. So what assumptions do we make about these helpers? We do assume that they have a moderately large amount of computational resource. Okay? They're not just this verifier that's trying to run their verification very, very quickly. They're willing to invest some time and some power into the system. They are not trusted. They absolutely should not be trusted. You want them to be... We're really assuming that these protocol might be run by miners, so if we had any trust in them whatsoever, then that would be bad. They cannot communicate with the original provers, okay? So the prover creates a proof, they communicate it to the verifier, and that's it, to the helper, sorry, and that's it. The helper does not then have to go back and talk to the prover again. And what they do is they aggregate the proofs together, not to reduce proof size, which is how this is usually done, but to reduce verifier time. And in blockchain applications, helpers are probably the miners. So what happens is you have many different provers, or possibly all the same prover, but lots of proofs being generated at least, which are all then fed into this helper. And at some point in time, the helper says, okay, these are the proofs that I'm going to help the verifier with. I'm going to create a single helper proof, and then a small proof per proof that I've been given, And I'm going to give this to the verifier so that the verifier then has this batch of M proofs and a single helper proof, and that's what the verifier checks. So when we do it like this, the verifier does end up with linear work in the field, not in the group, but it does have linear work, but it only has to run the linear work once. And then for all of the other proofs in the batch, it just has to, actually it doesn't even have to do a pairing because we can aggregate the pairings as well. It just needs to run a multi-exponentiation, or an exponentiation even. Yeah, a few exponentiations per proof. So when we actually implement this, you get sort of certainly the marginal costs being very, very fast. It wouldn't be worth it if you were just trying to aggregate 2 or 3 proofs, but once you're talking about aggregating lots of proofs, it really does become worth it.
So if you were to implement this then in the protocol, then you have to like really think about how you incentivize the helpers?
Definitely. Yeah, I'm assuming that the helpers would either have to be required to do this by protocol or rewarded in some way, because really the helpers get nothing out of doing this. So we do have an implementation of this work. I should say here, I'm saying thanks to Sean for the implementation, but he did a lot more than just the implementation. He helped with lots of the crypto as well. And the link to the implementation is on the slides. It was written in Rust. And this is some of the numbers that we got for Pedersen hashes and for SHA pre-images. The proof size is always the same. It's always 256 bytes. We were getting that the marginal verification time was usually 0.7 microseconds, or was it milliseconds? I can't remember. I know it's an important difference, sorry. The prover time grows linearly. So this is something where big improvements could probably be made by parallelizing, maybe using this DISC scheme that some authors came up with in Berkeley. Certainly it's something where investing lots of research and effort into trying to improve would make big differences, I think. And the helper time is very similar to the prover time because the actual operations that the helper is running are very similar. So what tools would we require to actually run this scheme? The first thing we would definitely need is a well-designed ceremony. Ideally, we wouldn't want to have every company running their own ceremony. We want one ceremony where every company says, this is our contribution to this ceremony publicly, preferably like on their website or on Twitter or something like that. The updates do need to be computed in order, is one thing that makes this slightly hard. So you can't have it such that one of you is computing an update proof and someone else is computing an update proof and then you put them together at the same time. It has to be the fact that you compute your update proof, you publish it. Someone else takes your published update proof, they update the parameters. So one by one by one. So this is something that I consider to be probably a human problem. How do we actually organize this kind of time slot situation? We definitely want it to be as open as possible. We don't want it to be the case that only people with good reputation can take part in this ceremony, because nothing is lost if someone dishonest takes part. Nothing bad happens at all, apart from maybe a verifier wastes a little bit of time. But if you don't have it so that a good variety of people can take part, then it becomes much harder to argue why you happen to be any more reputable than anyone else.
So isn't there a possible attack vector if like loads of people put some shit in it, and it becomes very hard, it takes a longer time to verify.
Yes, it is a possible attack vector. It's one that you probably have to consider. Calculating the updates is more expensive than doing the verification, but saying that, it is, if they're just doing it dishonestly, they might just output garbage. So it's something that would need to be considered. You also want to make it very easy for people to update to locate their update proof. Again, these things are very small. There's no reason why you couldn't make it easy to access them. And you don't want it to be the case that people can't point to their update and say, this was me, because otherwise, what's the point in the process? Another tool we need is a bilinear pairing group. And we also need there to be a large number of roots of unity in the field. This is the case with all SNARKs, so you always need to have lots of powers of 2, say dividing the order of the field, because otherwise you can't run fast Fourier transforms and it becomes expensive to compute the underlying polynomials. And one additional thing to point out here is that the sonic polynomials are a bit larger than the polynomials in previous SNARKs. Not much, but a little bit. So more roots of unity would be a good thing. But there are no proof elements on the second side of the pairing. So if you happen to have quite a large embedding degree, this wouldn't cause you a huge problem. We also need a hash function. Most things need hash functions, I'm sure that's fine. Oh, one thing I mentioned here. Sonic is proven secure in the random oracle model. One thing that would be quite nice to see, which doesn't currently exist, would be a language for converting applications into sonic constraints. So something a bit like Socrates.
So Socrates does Pinocchio and it does GM17?
Which are based on R1CS constraints, which are not the same as sonic constraints.
So what are sonic constraints?
They're similar to the bulletproof constraints. They've been modified a little bit, but they're not so different. And one thing that you probably don't want to do here if you're trying to make something that's really efficient, and actually is something that we did do in our implementation, is you probably don't want to take your R1CS constraints and say, here's a mapping from R1CS to this constraint system. Because the thing that's really sort of making the difference with our prover is the number of gates, whereas the way these R1CS constraints work is the number of wires. So it is, I would say, fundamentally different. We do need a rewarding system for the helper. No one's going to help us if we don't give them reason to. So yeah, it could be that the helper is run by the miners. If we assume a different application, not a blockchain application, but something where there's just one prover proving something that's very heavily parallelized, then they might be able to run the helper themselves. There's no reason why you couldn't do this. And yeah, it could be that the helper is financially incentivized. So just to sum up, Sonic, I'm calling it a nearly trustless setup in the sense that it's updatable and universal. It's not fully trustless, but it's making progress. Without a helper, we get very good asymptotics, but maybe not so good concrete numbers. But with a helper, we get a very small concrete overhead, and it becomes very usable in real systems. Thank you very much.